G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today on the show, we are presenting our audio documentary on anorexia. We recently finished doing a 13-part series on anorexia, and this episode is all of those parts condensed into a short documentary. Anorexia is a condition whereby people restrict their intake of food in order to achieve weight loss. Anorexia has deep psychological underpinnings and environmental factors that can lead to it developing. We will hear from leading experts in the anorexia field. We will also hear from those who have had the condition, and also those that are experts in the recovery process. But first, let's dive into what anorexia is. Leading expert Dr. Judith Brisman explains.
Well, anorexia is when someone willingly stops eating or restricts their eating and loses an extraordinary amount of weight, a lot of weight, in a short period of time. And one of the things that I want to say is a couple of things about anorexia. It looks like it's about food, and it looks like it's just about somebody wanting to be thin. But it actually, for the most part, is a psychological disorder that allows people to stop their feelings, to push down feelings, and to sort of form an identity around being a good person who doesn't eat. And the other thing I want to say is that we always think of anorexic as people who are incredibly skinny and that we would notice it right away. But if someone in a large body loses a lot of weight in a short amount of time by purposely restricting, that is potentially a sign of anorexia as well.
One of the biggest take-homes from that explanation of anorexia would have to be that anorexia is not defined just by the weight of a person, but by the restrictive eating habits and relationship with food that person has. This certainly highlights the complexity of the condition. Dr. Isabel Krug from the University of Melbourne will now explain how this relationship with food can change for those with anorexia.
Yeah, it can change very drastically, and obviously it depends again from person to person. I mean, it just starts with cutting out certain food groups that maybe that person considers as being high caloric content. But that obviously might not be enough, and then they continue cutting out other types of food. But it's not just about cutting out foods and having a less balanced diet. It's also about how they are engaging with food. So they might not really enjoy eating in front of other people anymore because they might have specific rituals, how they might be consuming the food. They might maybe divide the food based on specific, characteristics of the food. I don't know if it would be color or shape. Yeah, maybe that could be potentially not enjoyable with other people. So they actually start also eating in solitude. They kind of engage less in social meals. So yeah, there could be really drastic changes in terms of how somebody with anorexia would kind of consume food. Obviously, they count their calories. They would go to the supermarket and know exactly how many calories each food has. Would probably say, that they want to eat healthy food, but the main reason for consuming the healthy food is not because of it being healthy, but because it has less calories. Often they might also say that they could potentially have develop a food allergy, and then they are, gluten intolerant, and so that is a kind of allows them to cut out even more food items, and I guess they wouldn't have to provide any kind of justification for other people if they were able to say because of the food intolerance they can't eat certain items. So those are things that we commonly see in individuals that develop anorexia or already have anorexia or any other eating disorder, basically.
The usual onset for anorexia is in adolescence. However, unfortunately, we are seeing anorexia develop in very young children, some as young as 8. Let's take a deeper look with Dr. Judith Brisman.
The usual onset is teen years, but I hate to say it. We're seeing kids as early as 8. There are hospitals in the state that are filled to capacity for 8 to 10-year-olds at this stage of the game for anorexia. And we're in a really difficult culture that really insists that people be thin. And, that's starting to change. There's a health at every size movement. But when, with the onset of social media, so that young kids are seeing all over the place pictures of people who, that they're, supposed to be smaller, that there's already a diet culture amongst 5-year-olds. Usually it starts in teenage years. But it also can start at points of transition. So maybe when a kid goes off to college, or maybe when a little bit younger adult is starting a new job or looking for a job. But it usually starts when there's some sort of change in someone's life and emotions that have to be dealt with.
Anorexia is typically seen as a condition mostly affecting females. The reasons for this, whether they be environmental, biological or psychological, are not completely clear. Statistically speaking, 75% of those with anorexia are indeed female. I asked Dr. Isabel Krug from the University of Melbourne about why this is so.
So there is about 10% of those diagnosed with anorexia are males, so it's a 1 to 10 male to female ratio. I guess some people actually suggest, as I said before, that it's actually underestimated because it's more thought to be a female disorder rather than a male disorder. So probably males go undiagnosed. I think there's been a really big push in the last couple of years to improve diagnosis and treatment of males with anorexia. But actually the research that also we've done in the previous clinic where I've worked, we've compared presentation of males with an eating disorder or to females, and the presentation is quite similar. I mean, one aspect that is probably different and really important is there isn't so much of drive for thinness. There's probably more of a drive for muscularity because men strive to be more muscular versus the women want to be thinner. And 3 or 4, a couple of years ago, we didn't have the right measures to assess that, but now there have been a lot of measures that have been validated to assess drive for muscularity. So I think that's probably the biggest difference between males and females presentation, and the body dissatisfaction is slightly different. And also they say that maybe the age of onset could potentially be a bit higher in males than in females, but again, we might not potentially have the right studies to show that. Why it is more common in females than in males, that's a really good question. I think most of the risk factors could still apply for the males that we found for the females. Yeah, it's probably just considered to be a more female disorder from the beginning, and maybe we have underestimated the prevalence rate for males, and it is increasing, I think. And I think we don't really know exactly why it might be affecting women more than males. Maybe that in the past, women have had more pressure to have competing roles, so they need to be thin, they need to be successful at work, and they also, when they have children, need to take care of the children, versus maybe the males didn't experience as many pressures. Obviously, society is also changing, so I don't want to kind of stereotype that, but I mean, in the past, maybe the males would be not having to take on so many multiple roles, and so maybe potentially not experience as much stress as the females. That could be one reason. It's a bit of an outdated kind of theory, so I think we probably need to consider more up-to-date theories for the gender imbalance here.
The sources of anorexia generally is not well defined. In previous times, print media like magazines were the head of the blame as to why people were dissatisfied with their bodies and developed eating disorders to change them. With print media sales falling, it has been replaced with a new beast, social media. I asked Dr. Judith Brisman about how social media is impacting the rates at which anorexia is occurring.
Oh my God, it's so awful. I mean, I speak about Instagram and social media with every single one of my patients because, first of all, there's so many influencers out there who are eating disordered and who are telling the world what other people should eat. And I know some of them have been patients of mine over the years, but I think, there is a movement called Health at Every Size where there's a push for people to be able to appreciate bodies of all sizes. But what happens on social media is young women get on who are tiny and maybe have gained 2 pounds, and they'll show like a little wrinkle in their stomach and say, look, I'm accepting my body. And of course, the message is that for anyone who doesn't have the perfectly thin body, how can they feel if this person online is saying she's accepting her bigger body?
From the previous experts, we now have a good understanding of anorexia. However, how is it defined? Is it a disability? A mental health condition? Dr. Isabel Krug from the University of Melbourne tells all.
That's a good question. I mean, it is part of the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is about mental disorder, so it does define it as a disorder. But I mean, I guess it could also be phrased as a disability. I think every type of mental health illness could be phrased as a disability. So because it impacts the person's life and their functionality, and I think that's what obviously a disability does. So I think probably both could potentially be appropriate. Again, it probably depends on where you're living and what funding you might be getting depending on what terminology you use. So I know, for instance, in America, it's really important that a patient that attends the hospital gets the classification of a disorder in the DSM-5. Otherwise, the insurance doesn't cover the treatment. I guess Australia is probably a bit better in that sense. It still would need requirement, I guess, to get this kind of Medicare rebated session, which have increased in the last couple of years since they increased the numbers of sessions for eating disorders. So I don't know if with a disability you would be able to access those rebated sessions. I think you'd probably have to change the whole health system in Australia, because then you would have to consider all other mental illnesses similarly. You can't just consider the eating disorder like that, as I guess it could potentially be quite a difficult changing in terms of the definition, in terms of what impact it could have on treatment access to the person, if that makes sense.
With all we have learnt about anorexia, we have learnt what it is, how it impacts a person's relationship with food, when and why it occurs, but what does it do to the body? I asked Dr. Judith Brisman this very question.
What happens is the body goes into crisis mode. The body basically starts to say, oh, wow, I'm not getting enough fuel to live, so I need to stop using energy. So the heart rate slows, the blood pressure drops, which means this is where you see kids fainting or getting very lightheaded when they stand up. The hormonal system shuts down because certainly in female-identified bodies, that what the body is saying is, like, oh my God, I can't feed and give enough fuel for myself. I certainly can't have another living being in there. So the hormonal system stops. It's really interesting. The whole body slows down so that fuel isn't burned. Calories are fuel, and to make the body live. And I didn't know this until quite recently, but day to day, even our stomach churns day to day. Like even when we're not eating, it just keeps churning. And if someone gets into a really severe anorexic state, their stomach actually will slow down and stop churning, which means that what happens is if they start to eat something, it doesn't get digested. They have intense stomach pain, and so when someone's in that place, they actually really need medical care. And sometimes, it's funny because, Jack, what we're seeing often these days is not just one diagnosis. Like we're seeing a melange of symptoms. So we may get someone who's anorexic. I had a patient who certainly was restricting, but she also was a laxative abuser, and this was her way of purging. And it's really important. Laxatives, if anyone out there is taking laxatives, pay attention because they're addictive. By the time this person came in to see me, she was taking 100 X-Lax a day. And what happens when you start to use X-Lax or laxatives to control your bowel movements, what happens is you lose your water weight, so your stomach feels flat. So my patient felt very thin every time she took them, but your body gets inured to it. And so you have to take one and two, and it can get up to 100 before they actually work. But when they do work, at that stage of the game, it's messy. It's unpredictable when you're going to go to the bathroom. There are accidents. And again, you need medical care to go off of the laxatives because if you just abruptly stop, your body actually won't function right away. And of course, that can create incredible pain and bloating. So what we do is we work with doctors to slow down, titrate the use of laxatives, and then finally putting the very milder laxatives until the body kicks in itself. But there's just innumerable physical symptoms of it. But what my patients talk about and what I see when patients first come to me with anorexia is they're like a walking ghost. They look ashen, their eyes are sunken, but they'll say they don't, and when they get into recovery, they'll say, I don't remember anything around that time. Because it's funny. In the worst cases of anorexia, when the body has no fuel, no calories at all to go on, the body actually can start to eat away at muscle. It certainly eats the fat to get calories and fuel, but then it eats muscle, and it can also start to eat at the brain. So, but even when the brain is not fueled, even in the first few days of restriction, someone's not thinking clearly. So, in addition to the physical signs, what I just see are people don't, their memory's bad, their concentration is bad, and they're disconnected. They have a really hard time making connections.
After discussing anorexia with academic experts, let's hear from people who have actually had the condition. Cherry Boone O'Neill is the eldest daughter of American singer Pat Boone. Cherry developed anorexia in the early 1970s, in her teenage years. This was at a time when anorexia was not well understood across the medical field, and when the general public also did not have much knowledge about it. Let's hear from Cherry about what that era was like for those with anorexia.
When I was growing up, it was the time of Cher and Twiggy and, thin is in and thinner is better and thinnest is best kind of thing. And as a perfectionist, I kind of ascribed to that thought pattern too. But because of being a perfectionist, I wanted to do well in school as well. And I found that there was a class in my school that I was having trouble with. It was Chinese history. And to this day, I don't really know why it was important for an 8th grader to learn Chinese history, but I was really struggling with it. And so I started to pretend that I was sick. And I would pretend that I was throwing up. And our housekeeper at the time made the comment, well, it's easy to make yourself throw up. All you have to do is stick your finger down your throat. And of course, I hadn't been doing that. But I thought, wow, that's an interesting idea. And I would rifle through my mom's medicine cabinet to see if I could find something to kind of change my demeanor so that it would look like I was out of it, and I happened upon her diet pills. So between finding the diet pills and learning how to make myself throw up, that was the beginning of struggling with eating disorders. As I said, I started taking my mom's diet pills, and they were pretty much just glorified feed, really. And back then, that's what doctors prescribed for women who were trying to lose weight. And I started to get hooked on them, and I liked the way they made me feel. I liked the way they helped me have energy to stay up and work on school projects and, get my good grades that were so important to me. But my mom discovered that I was taking her diet pills and ended up canceling her prescription. And as a result, both of us ended up gaining some weight. And I was very self-conscious about that, especially as we were starting to perform and be on stage and have to fit into costumes and so on. And so after a couple of insults from friends at school and being razzed a little bit and taking it very personally, I decided that I was going to get it under control. And I started dieting and exercising very healthfully at first. But the insidious thing about an eating disorder is that it can start out kind of innocently, trying to gain control over your body. And the further it goes, the more it begins to take control of you. And I went from the point of, eating 2 to 3 healthy meals a day and exercising, maybe an hour, 90 minutes a day, to then exercising 5 to 6 hours a day and only having one meal because I couldn't get out of having dinner with my family. And so I ended up losing a lot of weight, but became very adept at covering it up with layers of clothing. My doctor didn't even tell me the name of what I was struggling with. I thought I was just some isolated freak going through this weird behavior all by myself, and I thought it was just a behavioral issue. I didn't realize that there was a psychological element or mental health aspect to it, and so I thought I should be able to muster up the willpower to change. It was really a long battle, and it wasn't until I was 20 years old that I finally read an article that was in Time or Newsweek magazine that gave this crazy, pattern of behavior a name and let me know that there were therapists and doctors that were trying to work on treatment, and that there were others like me that were going through the same thing. So for years I was struggling with this, not knowing what it was or that there were other people like me or that there might be any hope to overcome it.
Cherry was going through her anorexia in the 1970s. But let's now hear from Kelsey Osgood, who wrote the anorexia memoir, How to Disappear Completely. Kelsey went through her anorexia in the 1990s. Cherry highlighted the anorexia field in the 1970s and early 1980s. But how far have we come since the 1990s? Kelsey Osgood tells us. Do you think since the 90s that we have gotten a lot better at educating people about anorexia, or is it we still got a long way to go in that?
I don't think we had a long way to go at the time, to be honest. I don't think that there's really, I think it's always tempting to say that we need greater awareness around a topic. I think even when I was a teenager and I was first hospitalized in the year 2000, people, compared to the statistical number of people who have a clinical eating disorder, people were very aware of what anorexia and bulimia were. Maybe there was some lingering insensitivities to it, but there was really this enormous push, particularly starting with the death of Karen Carpenter in 1983 in the U.S., where that was really trying to tell people, this isn't about weight. It's about any number of things. It's about control. It's about people pleasing. It's about these nefarious cultural forces, the diet industry or magazines. And so by the time that I was in treatment, starting in 1999, this was like this is among a certain group, and I would argue that by now it's probably trickled down pretty far. There was a pretty good conception of what an eating disorder was. So I don't actually think that there's probably all that much to do in this respect at this point. I think that the hope was that, okay, once we sort of get a better idea of what eating disorders are, into the hands of every person, that maybe that would somehow lead to just I'm not sure exactly, that people would be able to spot it better, or that people would feel more inclined to get treatment. I don't think that has had really much effect. I don't think that the growing awareness has had really all that much effect on the actual numbers of people who struggle with eating disorders.
One of the biggest catalysts for those in the medical field, and also for those in the general public, in coming to understand anorexia was the death of recording artist Karen Carpenter. This happened in 1983, shortly after the release of Cherry Boone O'Neill's anorexia memoir, Starving for Attention. Cherry was friends with fellow anorexia sufferer, Karen Carpenter. And in this section of an interview I did with Cherry, she remembers Karen's struggle with the condition, but also how her death impacted the world. Not long before the book came out, the world lost Karen Carpenter to anorexia. Do you remember the day that she passed?
I remember hearing about it, yeah. I remember being in shock because we had traveled in a lot of the same circles. We had the same record producer. We had been at some of the same events together. And when I ended up moving to Washington State from California to get help and to start my recovery process, my mother had run into Karen at an event, and my mom could tell that Karen was struggling, and so she told Karen that I was going through something similar and that I had been working on my recovery and had had some success, and that now I had, just had my first child, and, that I might be able to offer some hope for her. And so she gave her my phone number.
Like, how did she sound? Did she sound like she really needed help? Was she really in with the anorexia? Did she really need help?
She knew that she was struggling. She was not an exerciser. She didn't make herself, she didn't do the method of making herself throw up the way I did. She used syrup ipecac, which is very dangerous and very scary because it can actually deteriorate your internal organs because it stays in your body. And I was concerned for her because I knew about that. And I really had tried to urge her to do what I did, and that was kind of move away from all the pressures of LA. And she did, but she moved to New York City, which is not that different. And she was in the care of Dr. Stephen Levincon, who had written the book, The Best Little Girl in the World, and that was made into a movie. And he was seen as kind of like the expert on the topic. But he had her hospitalized, and he had other patients, and he left town to go do something at one point, and so she dismissed herself from the hospital and came back to California because she had this idea that she could set a time period, like a timeline for her own recovery, which of course you can't. It has to be open-ended. It's going to take as long as it's going to take, and you have to be willing to do that. But she was in a very unique place of being kind of the hub of the wheel that was the Carpenters, like her brother, all the other musicians, the, producers, tour people, all, she was the center of that. And if she wasn't well and able to perform, none of them were going to be doing anything either. And so she felt that pressure. And when the opportunity came for her to leave the hospital and come back to California, she did. But unfortunately, we know how that ended, and it was a terrible loss.
Do you think if we had a better understanding, say like the understanding today, back in the 80s of anorexia, that Karen might have survived and still be with us?
I think that's very possible. I mean, we can't know for sure, but I think if she had gone into therapy and had gotten away from the pressures of the entertainment lifestyle and had been willing to commit to however long it was going to take and really work on the interior stuff, and not just, the weight gain and eating and all the things that are the external symptoms. I think there could have been a chance for her to survive and recover. And I guess we'll never know for sure, but I can tell you when I'm, out and about at a grocery store or something and I hear a Carpenter song come on over the stereo, I have mixed reactions because I'm so sad that we lost her and yet so grateful that my story ended differently,
Did Karen's passing change the way the world thought about anorexia? Did it kind of bring it more to the mindset of people? Like, this is something that's going on and we need to pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it got people's attention. It kind of brought to them the seriousness of eating disorders. I mean, anorexia is a mental health issue that has a 10% mortality rate, which is about the highest mortality rate of any mental health issue. So, it was a serious thing back then, but people didn't realize it until somebody as notable and as public as Karen Carpenter passed away from it. And that was what really jolted people and got their attention and thought, okay, this isn't something to be joking around with. This is serious. And the fact that I had written my book and it had come out right about the same time, I think people finally felt not only that it was okay to talk about it, but that it was important to talk about it too.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. Today we are presenting a documentary on anorexia. Let's now hear as to why anorexia develops from those who have had it. Author Britney Burgunder and recovered anorexia sufferer Christine Japp showcases some of the reasons as to why it occurs.
I think I realized there was something a little bit wrong or just different about me even before anorexia entered my life. I developed anxiety and depression at a really young age, but I was too young to understand my distressing feelings and why I felt the way I did. And that kind of slowly turned into start engaging in behaviors to release my emotions and keep my mind busy. And that's when that manifested into an eating disorder. But initially I was oblivious to it. I didn't really know what an eating disorder was. But each time I engaged in these weird behaviors and rules that revolved around food and numbers and weight and all that stuff, it eased my mind and it quieted my anxiety and it distracted me away from sort of just, what I didn't want to feel. I think when I realized I had a problem with food or an eating disorder, it was, about 13 years old. I could tell I was losing weight, I was counting calories, and I didn't really know what it meant. I knew at that point I had a problem with food, and my parents were quick to intervene and diagnose quite soon thereafter.
Would you say that was the anorexia brought on, did anyone ever make any comments about about your weight, or was it more the anxiety kind of realms?
For me, it was more a combination. I was just naturally, I would say, more predisposed to having anxiety and depression. But that being said, I also, early on, I often teased and bullied by my peers. I loved sports and I was very athletic. So, they would make fun of me even for that or for, I looked different than them. I felt always that I was bigger and too strong and I looked like an athlete. So that definitely played a big part, is that I just felt like I didn't fit in with my peers, and they and then that in combination with bullying and already kind of having low self-esteem, it just sort of set the stage for this to happen.
Did you have this sense that you wanted to be perfect in a way? Was that kind of strive for perfection something that brought it on?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very driven, just always thinking that I wanted to be the best, needed to be the best, and that really, again, stemmed from just having no self-esteem, no self-worth, and I felt that if I could be perfect or if I could be the best at something, if I could be super successful, it would sort of overshadow how I really felt inside and mask how awful I truly felt. And yeah, I did. I thought, hey, if I'm perfect, if I, maybe that's what's wrong with me. If I can look perfect or if I'm thinner, then maybe I'll be happy. Then maybe I'll have friends. Then maybe I won't feel so terrible in my head all the time. So that was definitely a belief of mine early on.
When did you start to notice that anorexia was becoming a problem for you?
The very first time, it was when I was in year 8, so I was around 12 years old. There was this feeling of something was wrong with me. I just kept having this thought that something's wrong with me. I have to do something to fix it. And somehow I pinpointed that I was eating too much, and so I tried to fix that by eating less and less. In a way, it kind of felt like I was making up for my wrongness, or atoning for my wrongness. It felt a bit virtuous by denying food and restricting. I also began to exercise more, and then it started to become more and more obsessive, and I kept on being haunted by all these negative thoughts, lots of self-criticism, critical thoughts, and intense feelings of fear and guilt and shame. And that fear is so intense. It's like, I can't even describe it. It's like worse than the fear of death. And it's such a bizarre feeling because I didn't even know what exactly I was scared of. And I had no idea about anorexia nervosa, and neither did my family. So we were all kind of like, something's not right, don't know what's going wrong. And then eventually, towards the end of the year, my dad took me to hospital, and that's when they diagnosed me with anorexia nervosa. And then I got admitted to inpatient at the Children's Hospital, and I made a pretty good recovery. I was kind of stable when I got discharged, and then I continued back to school, everything as normal. And then I started relapsing after first year of uni, and that was much more severe. And I was aware of what was happening because I had experienced it before. I knew. I was like, okay, I'm relapsing. I should do something about it. But the fear was still so intense that I avoided going back into inpatient treatment, even though I knew that would have been the most effective way to help me to gain the weight to recover.
For you, Christine, did you find that with the anorexia, did you think that did it develop because you wanted a sense of control, or did you have feelings towards like weight and things like that?
It's very hard to really pinpoint because I think I did have a little bit of those feelings of wanting to control, and like food and exercise, that's like something that I could control. But at the same time, I also knew that there was something else, like some other force that was driving this obsession. It wasn't just wanting to control, because like there's lots of other things that I could have chosen to control. And then also another thing is I didn't have this fear of being like fat or gaining weight or anything like that. It was for me more for something was wrong with me, like just a lot of shame, I think, shame and self-criticism and all that. Yeah, so it's very bizarre.
We now know how it can occur, but how does anorexia affect daily life once it has occurred? Kelsey Osgood explains.
Well, I mean, when you're very sick with anorexia, there's not the average person who's very ill with anorexia. Their daily life is probably unimaginably dull to the average person. It's very regimented. It's hard for me to really remember in a lot of ways. There's an enormous amount of time and energy was spent on food, thinking about when you are next going to eat food, calculating the number of calories that you ate, calculating, the sort of amount of exercise you did. When I was in college, I had big chunks of time when I was in college when I was really unwell, or I would have to leave school to be hospitalized. And a lot of that time was I had some semblance of a social life at various points in time, and so I would have to spend a lot of time thinking about how I would avoid going out to eat with people or things like that. So, if you're really sick, if you're in a really bad position, health-wise, it can be very disruptive to sleep. It can be very disruptive to your mood. Yeah, it's not a pleasant way to live. It's very attenuating. It's very hard to have relationships with other people. I do not recommend it.
It can be hard for the family members of those with anorexia to notice all the signs of anorexia at once. But it is also difficult for the person going through anorexia to realise what's happening over time as their view of food and habits with food changes. Kelsey Osgood and Christine Japp explain. Do you think you were aware of the anorexia as it was gradually happening and developing, or did it kind of just happen over time?
No, I was 100% aware. I knew the whole time. I went running straight into the headlights, which is not necessarily, it's not normal. It's a little abnormal. I think it happens more now because more people know what anorexia is. And it was at the time, it was normal for girls to say things like, oh, I wish I could just be a little anorexic, because there wasn't it wasn't, I mean, I think maybe it was thought of as distasteful, but it wasn't thought of as like wildly offensive, I guess. And it was normal for people to experiment. And it's even normal for people to talk about like feeling that, that there was some sort of romance to the idea of anorexia, in the first place. For me, I think most of the people that I met, of all the people that I've known, or certainly all the people that I met through treatment, I was kind of the person who was the most aware of like, I am pursuing this thing. But there is like a pretty big spectrum between like me and the person who it happens completely in a vacuum and they have no idea what they're doing. And then just all of a sudden one day they faint because they haven't been eating. And I think that starting in the 90s and continuing up until today, fewer and fewer people are that sort of organic anorexic. Most people are coming to it with some sort of preconceived ideas of like, what is this, of what this thing is and what it means and what it communicates. What does this say about me that I have it? It says, that I'm a perfectionist, that I am a people pleaser, that I'm very disciplined, that sort of thing.
Did you find that you were like actively aware of kind of like what was going on, or did it kind of was it just happening?
At the beginning, I didn't realize. Of course, no one was. It's quite subtle because it happens gradually. That I felt more and more urges to restrict and exercise, and it just grew and grew and grew over time. But eventually, I realized something's wrong. But I was too scared to talk about it or seek help or anything. Then my parents were concerned, and they would get angry at me for not eating, and kind of exacerbated it, because the angrier that they got, the more shame and self-criticism I felt, the more that I felt I needed to restrict and exercise in order to try and cope.
How did you view food during this time? Like, did you fear food? Was that the feeling?
Yes. So I had a list of like so-called safe foods. And that list also would change over time and become more and more restrictive. But things like vegetables, they were safe. So I would focus more on eating the vegetables, and anything that's on the like fear food list, things that are like high energy, high fat content, I would feel a lot of anxiety and fear if I had to eat it or even think about eating it.
As mentioned previously, anorexia is found more in females than in males. However, males still do get anorexia. David Chanwer is a UK-based comedian who suffered with anorexia for many years. In an interview with him, I asked him if going through anorexia was different for males than for females. Here is what he said.
I mean, like, honestly, I always kind of say, like, I always think, I wouldn't be expected to be treated differently if I was a man, woman, or trans, if I went to the dentist, or what with my mental health. But I do think that, sort of recent research suggests that anywhere between 10 and 25% of anorexics are men. So generally it does, affect female counterparts. But the only time I've ever been very aware of being a man was I was going through therapy for the anorexia, and I was dating this girl, and she'd actually dumped me 3 times. Like, it was this real on-off thing, and I was in a really vulnerable space. And one of my mates said, look, why don't you go to group therapy for anorexia? And there's only one group therapy there. And I remember I turned up and I sort of said, my name's Dave, and I'm here because I'm currently going through therapy for anorexia, and I've just been dumped. And I think one of the things about the anorexia is I'm lonely, and I kind of want to find someone. And then they're like, the next girl went like, hi, my name's Josie, and I'm here because I've been recovered for the last 3 years, but I haven't dated anyone. in the past 5 years, and my number is 0778. And I was like, this is speed dating, right? And it felt, I've got to admit, I was like, that was the only time I was like, this is bad but good at the same time.
Yeah, right. Is it is it different going through it though as a dude? I mean, like, is it a different experience? Like, and do different things cause it, or like, what do you reckon?
I think there's certainly being all honest. I think there are certain challenges that are more difficult for women. For example, when I actually left treatment, I was like overweight, which is like, is that success? Is that failure?
Yeah.
But I do think that men are judged less on their looks than women. If you say to a bloke, oh, you've got a bit porky, then generally that bloke, no one likes people commenting on their body. But I think it's easier to, oh yeah, you're a bit chubby. For a bloke, that has different connotations than it does for people that are female. So I think that is different. I find it weirder that more blokes don't get anorexia. I find it weird, kind of in a flip side. I don't know how kind of people get through without an eating disorder. And I say that, I've obviously come full circle and I'm at the other side. But I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and I normally wouldn't say anything like this, but I stupidly thought, oh, he's got a very good relationship with food. And I said, oh mate, you've lost weight. And he got really angry. He was like, no, I've trimmed down. I've been going to the and he was really, because he's a real like fighter and a bodybuilder, and he thought the idea of losing weight was terrible, was awful. And to me, I was like, that's mad. So I think there are certain challenges for men that women don't have of that thing. I think something that is both familiar to male and female is generally when you lose weight, people say, well done, which is why it kind of drives me a little bit like clueless that more people don't struggle, or at least openly, because if people keep on saying like, congratulations, well done, I don't know anyone who doesn't like getting positive compliments. And the implication there is that putting on weight is bad. So that was kind of one of the things that started it, but also sustained it. Blokes come up to me and talk to me about after shows a lot. Is one of the things about the anorexia is that generally it can tend to numb unwanted emotions, unwanted thoughts, because it's kind of like, if you don't put any fuel in your car, it won't run. If you don't feed your brain, then it will start shutting down. And one of the things that I didn't like, and one of the reasons that I can't help to think why eating disorders are so prevalent during teenage years, is as I started to go through puberty, I started to get all of these, sexual urges and stuff. And A, that was like pretty terrifying. But B, I think I was fed a kind of narrative that blokes only want one thing and blokes are all out for sex. So there was a kind of, there was a weird twisted narrative there, because on the one hand, I was thinking, you know what, I never want to objectify anybody. I never want to treat anyone different based on their looks. However, as I started going through puberty, I, started to find people more attractive. And if I went up and acted on that, let's say I saw an attractive woman in a bar, if I went and spoke to her, I'm only doing that because I find her attractive. So I'm only doing that based on her looks. And I couldn't work out how you can have a libido but not objectify people. And genuinely just starving out that urge was so much easier, and starving out that kind of masculinity and all of those things kind of made me, I felt at the time, like a blank slate.
We have heard from Britney Burgunder a few times. Uniquely about Britney and her story is the fact that her anorexia morphed into binge eating disorder, with Britney going from underweight to obese within a year. She explains how anorexia can lead to other eating disorders.
I had been struggling with anorexia for about 7-8 years, and I finally got to a point where my sister was having a party and there was a bunch of leftover food, and I finally just broke, I guess, and I let myself have some. And then once I started, it was like I couldn't stop. It was the most amazing feeling I don't even know how to describe it, but after 7 years of depriving myself of all my favorite foods and then finally being like, okay, you can eat them. I mean, it was exhilarating. It was incredible. But that being said, the problem was I couldn't really stop. So pretty quickly my anorexia morphed into binge eating disorder, but really I had just traded one method of coping for the other. And, I hadn't really at that point in my life, I was not in recovery, and I kind of just traded one for the other. And the only thing that changed really was my behaviors. I still felt the same as when I was anorexic and also struggling with binge eating disorder.
Was the binge eating disorder just as isolating, would you say?
Yes. Yes. In fact, equally so, really. I started, my life then became similar in that I shut myself in my house because I was very embarrassed about how much weight that I had quickly put on. And so I never wanted anyone to see me. And in fact, really the only time that I would venture out of my house was to buy binge food. And even that was a process that I tried to be as secretive as I could about it. And even early on, I was so embarrassed just by the quick transformation of my body. And I felt like a failure, just for struggling with anorexia for all those years. It kind of becomes a part of your identity. And so I very much felt like a failure for now not being able to stop eating. And so if anyone asked, or old friends, if they asked how I was, I would just pretend I was fine. I'd pretend I looked great. I didn't update any of my social media pictures to a current one. I just I tried to hide all of it from everyone.
It is hard for the family to know what to do when someone is going through anorexia. Here is Christine Japp's story and how her family went about her anorexia.
At the beginning, they just tried to cook more food that I would like, or encourage me to eat more at the table and be like, come on, have a bit more of this, or this one's your favorite, have more of this. And then when they saw that I continued to deteriorate and it was just getting worse, then their concern grew, and they expressed that concern through anger. So they would get angry at me for not being able to eat. They thought that it was a personal choice. They thought that I was choosing to be rebellious and not follow instructions and all that. And then they felt really helpless because they realized that, hey, this is really bad. They took me to the doctor, and eventually my dad took me to the emergency room. And this was after a year of them trying to encourage me and do lots of other things to get me to eat. And then in the emergency room, that's when I got my diagnosis. And then they started to realize that, this is an actual illness. In the hospital, I was forced to, every meal was supervised. I was forced to eat according to the meal plan. That's when I managed to gain weight. And then, it became easier as I gained weight. The thoughts became less intense. The urges were less intense. And, it was really effective to get that weight back on. But the process was really, really tedious and really horrible.
Knowing Christine's story, now let's hear from Britney Burgunder again, this time about how she thinks families can go about helping their loved ones with anorexia.
Yeah, the best thing, I'm very fortunate that my parents were aware that something was going on with me. I was very stubborn and not wanting help for my eating disorder for many, many years. So although they tried to help me and give me resources that would also help, I still wasn't really ready to accept it. That being said, they provided me with so much unconditional love, and just listening to me, just having a family member, have a listening ear, even if they don't fully understand. I think it's just really important to understand the individual. They're going through something, and they're really struggling with their life, but they might not understand how to talk about it. So just you want to intervene when you can, but also just try to try to lead them to the right resources and be there when they're ready to talk.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. Today we are presenting a documentary on anorexia. Now that we have heard from the professors and those with lived experience, let's talk about recovery. Here are sections of an interview I did with leading recovery expert Carolyn Costin. Here are those sections from that interview. What is the best time for someone to seek help with their anorexia?
Well, certainly as soon as possible. I mean, because this is an illness that's progressive, and as it continues, people, I kind of call it their brain gets hijacked, by it. And so I think when someone starts losing weight, starts restricting a bunch of categories of food, and as soon as they start to feel, or their loved ones around them start to feel, this looks like something they can't sway from. It looks like it's no longer a choice anymore, like, oh, I'm going to skip desserts, when it becomes, I can't eat desserts. Because what happens in anorexia nervosa, it starts out, oh, certain food is fattening and I want to avoid that. And it becomes not certain food, all food starts to seem fattening. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the amount and the kinds of food the person can eat, feels comfortable eating.
I would imagine then it would be very difficult for someone to ask for help with their anorexia.
Well, we call anorexia nervosa egosyntonic, which means that the ego of the person who has it kind of feels successful. They feel like I'm accomplishing, Like me, when I went on a diet in high school, all my friends went on a diet, and I'm the one who lost the weight, and I could do it, and other people couldn't do it, and I felt like, wow, I'm so successful and good at something. And partly that's a temperament thing. It's not 100%, but we know now with studies on genetic predisposition that a huge percentage of people with anorexia nervosa have kind of a perfectionistic, driven personality, the kind of kid who's, getting the straight A's and all that. And they sort of, what I say all the time is, in high school I got straight A's in my grades and a straight A in dieting, It's just where you're applying that temperament to. So even watching kids when they're younger and noticing if they have that kind of temperament and you see them starting to apply it to food, that's something to be watchful for, because when you apply it to other things, like you're getting praise for it, if you're getting good grades and things like that, and you're so organized and you're the type that helps your mom all the time or whatever. But if you start applying that to counting calories and fat grams, it's a whole different ballgame,
What does it look like step by step, the recovery?
Well, it's certainly different for different people. I mean, I do have a book called 8 Keys to Recovery, which sounds weird. I was asked by Norton and Sons to write this book, and my first response was, it's in a series of books they have called 8 Keys to Recovery from, migraines or depression. And I said, 8? There's like so many. But I realized when I decided what are the main factors and how do I put them, together in 8, huge categories. And so, that tells a little bit of it. But I would say the first really, really important thing, and if people get anything from this segment on your show or whatever, it would be this, that everybody who walks in the door has a healthy self. Every person I see with anorexia comes in, they have a healthy self in there. And it has been taken over by what I call this alter ego state, and that's the eating disorder self. And they might not recognize it at first, but when you begin to talk to them, you can ask them questions where they're smart. They know if you say, would you feed your friend the same way you feed yourself? Would you, if you were babysitting a 7-year-old, would you tell her she can't eat pizza because she's going to get fat? And when they say no, which they do, I've not had anybody yet say, no, I would say that to a kid. I say, why can't you say that to yourself? What has happened that you can't say that to yourself? The battle is between you and you, the two parts that you're living with. And parents will say, I feel like I lost my kid, I can't find my kid in there. There is a healthy self in there. The reason I think I have success is I recovered myself because I went through this myself. I had to realize I could hear voices in my head. I remember specifically going to a party in college and telling myself when I got to the party, you can't eat one thing at this party. And then another part of me said, but that's easy for you. You can go in there and skip things. That's easy. What you have to do is do what other people do. Just have one cookie or two cookies or a piece of cake. You know, the fear when you have anorexia nervosa really is that you can't do that anymore because you're breaking your rules. You don't know where it's going to end. You might go, what are you going to do the next day? You know? So this concept that I have called strengthening the healthy self, where you don't get into a battle with the person because they will win. People die from anorexia nervosa because you can't really force anyone. You can put them in the hospital. You can do all kinds of supervision and force feeding and tube feeding. They get out, they can lose it again. And the only way to heal somebody from this is to help them make this internal shift where I say, we're not going to get rid of this ego state that you have developed. We're going to integrate it back into your whole self. And it will no longer need the eating disorder behaviors. It will just serve as your alarm system. You can still have control over things. It'll still tell you if if it was meeting some need, if your eating disorder was solving some purpose in your life, like it made you feel more special or it helped you feel in control. Your healthy self can do that in better ways that aren't self-destructive. So I talk about integrating the eating disorder self and healthy self, and it really feels to patients like you're not trying to get rid of me. You're not trying to get rid of something that I think is important. And I think that's been a big key.
For successful recovery, is it important to identify the possible reasons as to why the anorexia might have developed, like some people like it's a sense of control?
Such a good question, but here's my surprising answer. I don't think you have to know why you got sick in order to get better. I think people spend too much time. I think insight, I think understanding the whys you developed anorexia is like a bridge, an insight into, why that might have happened. But people get stuck on the bridge and searching for the why. I think I would have been stuck. I think it's not that the why isn't important, and sometimes it's good, and especially if people are talking about their fear of losing control and things like that. But I've treated people who have had all kinds of histories and all kinds of things that happened, and it's not that I don't talk to them about it and have empathy for that, but at the end of the day, talking about those things doesn't change someone's behavior. If someone understands, I was abused and that caused me to go into restricting for some reason, I mean, for one thing, you can say not everybody who's abused restricts their food, so we can't necessarily say that caused it, right? Or I'm a very controlling person and so I just controlled my food. Well, a lot of people are controlling and they don't have anorexia nervosa. So we can look at the temperament and look at how you can ease up and mitigate your temperament, which I think is a good thing to do. But I think what's really important, and I tell people all the time, I don't have to know all the reasons why you got sick in order to help you get better. What is the problem right now? What's interfering with your life? What can't you do with food that you used to be able to do? What can't you do with food that you'd like to be able to do? What have you lost? Like some people lose relationships, they get, kicked off the track team, they have to drop out of uni. There's all kinds of things that happen. And but even more importantly, control is usually a big issue. People like to feel like they have willpower and control. And one of the other things I do is I think it's super important to show people you think you're in control, but you're not really in control anymore. Like it feels like you're in control, like, I can control the calories I'm eating and all that. But I'll say, here's a cookie. I'll put a cookie in front of them and say, show me you can eat that cookie, because that's harder for you right now than not eating it. If you really want to show me you have willpower, you can eat the cookie. And that doesn't mean you have to ever eat cookies. I don't care. I don't care if that's in your diet. But what I do care about is your brain is not obligated to not eat things, that you really have free will and a free choice. And so I'm using their logic. I think sometimes people try to say, you shouldn't be so disciplined, or you shouldn't rely so much on willpower, or you're so controlling. And what I say is, look, you have that temperament. How do you use that for your best good? And how do you really show me that you have willpower? It would be, you're going to show me because I know it's harder for you to eat that cookie. That's the hardest thing to do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it. Overall, across the sector, how affordable would you say it to get better is?
Well, it depends on when you enter treatment. I mean, if you enter treatment and and go into outpatient therapy, and you happen to get hooked up with a good outpatient therapist who knows how to treat eating disorders and who treats you individually instead of just sticking you in a box. I'm concerned about everyone wanting to do family-based treatment or everybody wanting to do cognitive behavioral therapy. Those are both important, very important, but they don't work in all cases, so you have to have somebody who treats you as an individual and looks at these aspects that I'm talking about. Then I think it doesn't have to be that costly. And also it's why I'm training coaches nowadays. That's my whole, I have a lot of coaches in Australia. I have coaches in 16 different countries, and what I teach coaches to do are the things that I'm talking about right now. And coaches are a lot less, they're not licensed, they're certified by me. I opened an institute after I sold my treatment centers and said, what's missing in this field? It used to be residential treatment, but now there's a lot of sober coaches and life coaches and leadership coaches. There were no eating disorder coaches and no training to help someone know how to do it. So it's about a year program. It takes time. They don't easily become a coach. They have to do an internship and pass that and everything else. But then they go and they help clients like between the sessions. So if you meet with your therapist once a week, for example, you can meet with a coach who will go out and have that meal with you, go out with you when you're going to try pizza for the first time, take you to the store and help you buy a new pair of pants when you've gone up a size, and that might feel traumatic to you. If you feel like purging in the middle of the night, you can call your coach. These are the things that you don't really do with a therapist. They don't have the time to do it, and in some cases, it's not even really ethical for them because some coaches go over to your house and help you go grocery shopping and stock up your house with food. And so I think that is becoming, I didn't know how big it was going to get, but it feels to me like it's interestingly going to be a game changer in the field because people, they can't just do it with once-a-week therapy, and when that doesn't work, they often end up in very costly and expensive hospital or residential programs, and I think this is a step in between, and that's what I'm seeing.
That was our documentary on anorexia. If you liked what you heard today, we have a 13-episode series we just finished on anorexia, which you can find on our podcast. Tune in a fortnight when I talk with Mount Everest climber Bonita Norris about her journey with bulimia. And if you liked this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.